Okay, so I never thought I'd be posting on Reddit like this, but I don't know where else to turn. I need to get this out before it's too late. If anything happens to me, you'll know why. My name is Matt, and I'm just an average guy. Well, I was until I did something incredibly stupid. It all started about 3 weeks ago. I've always been into tech, hacking, and stuff like that. Nothing major, just some amateur dabbling in coding and a bit of harmless fun. But then, out of sheer boredom, I started digging around on the dark web. I'd heard stories about the stuff you could find there, and my curiosity got the better of me. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just poking around, seeing what was out there. One night, I stumbled upon a forum that was unlike anything I'd seen before. It was heavily encrypted, and the people there seemed to know their stuff. I saw a thread titled, Top Secret Government Leaks, and I couldn't resist. I clicked on it and was led to a treasure trove of documents, videos, and audio files. The things I found there were beyond belief. Detailed accounts of covert operations, experiments on unwilling subjects, and even plans for future events that were downright horrifying. One document in particular caught my eye. It was labeled Project Nightshade. I still get chills thinking about it. It detailed a series of experiments conducted on homeless people and inmates people society wouldn't miss. They were testing some kind of neurotoxin that could control thoughts and behavior. The effects were terrifying. People were driven to madness, compelled to do unspeakable things, and eventually, their bodies just shut down. I knew I should have stopped there, but my curiosity and a twisted sense of justice pushed me forward. I copied everything I could find and decided to leak it. People needed to know what was going on. I created a new email, signed up for a bunch of forums, and started uploading the files everywhere I could think of. Reddit, 4chan, conspiracy sites, you name it. I even sent copies to a few journalists. I thought I was doing the right thing, exposing the truth. The next day, things started getting weird. My internet slowed to a crawl, and I couldn't access half the sites I usually visit. Then, my phone started acting up. Random reboots, apps crashing, strange numbers calling me and hanging up. I was paranoid, sure, but I figured it was just a coincidence. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside my apartment made me jump. 2 days later, the real nightmare began. I was at home trying to piece together more information about Project Nightshade when I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I ignored it. Then, the knock came again, louder this time. I crept to the peephole and saw 2 men in black suits standing there, looking impatient. My heart nearly stopped. I backed away, hoping they'd think I wasn't home. But then I heard a third man's voice, more authoritative. "Mr. Adams, we know you're in there. Open up, or we'll make this difficult." How did they know my name? Panic set in. I grabbed my laptop, shoved it into my backpack, and headed for the fire escape. As I climbed out the window, I heard them busting through my door. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran down the alley, not looking back, and ducked into a nearby convenience store to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it would burst out of my chest. I knew I couldn't go back home. I pulled up my hoodie, kept my head down, and started walking. I didn't have a plan, just knew I needed to keep moving. Over the next few days, I stayed in cheap motels, using cash to avoid leaving a trail, but they always seemed to be one step behind. Every time I thought I was safe, I'd see them. Black suits, dark sunglasses, and those damn SUVs. The scariest part was the dreams, or maybe they were hallucinations. I started seeing things, shadowy figures in the corners of my room, whispers in languages I couldn't understand, and the faces of the people from the Project Nightshade documents. Their hollow eyes and twisted expressions haunted me. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Then, about a week ago, I hit rock bottom. I was staying in another dingy motel, trying to get some sleep, when I heard someone talking outside my window. I peeked through the blinds and saw 2 men in suits just standing there, staring up at me. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my backpack and bolted out the back door, not caring where I ended up. Now, I'm writing this from a rundown internet cafe in some town I don't even know the name of. I haven't eaten in 2 days, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. They're closing in, and I don't have anywhere else to run. If you're reading this, please be careful. Don't go looking for the things I found. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. I don't know if I'll make it through the night, but at least I've warned you. If anything happens to me, you'll know the truth. Stay safe, and don't make the same mistakes I did." After posting my last message, I kept moving. I figured staying in one place for too long would only make it easier for them to find me. I spent the night in a 24-hour laundromat, pretending to read an old magazine while keeping an eye on the door. Every creak and groan of the building made me jump. By morning, I was exhausted, but I had to keep going. I decided to head to a nearby city, thinking I could lose myself in the crowd. I hopped on a bus, paying with the last of my cash. The ride was a blur. I kept my head down, but I could feel the eyes of the other passengers on me. Paranoia was eating me alive. Every time we stopped, I half expected to see the men in suits waiting to drag me off the bus. When I finally arrived, I found a dingy hostel and paid for a bed with some coins I scrounged from my backpack. The place was dirty, the kind of place where people don't ask questions. I figured it was the best I could do for now. I needed to rest, to think about my next move. That night, I had the worst dream yet. I was back in my apartment, sitting at my computer. The screen was filled with the documents I'd found, but the words kept shifting, morphing into images of tortured faces and mutilated bodies. The sound of screaming filled the room, echoing off the walls. Then, one of the faces turned to look at me, its eyes empty and soulless. It started to speak, but all I could hear was a guttural whisper, like nails on a chalkboard. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I couldn't stay there. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating me. I packed up and left, wandering the streets aimlessly. I felt like a ghost, invisible and unnoticed by the crowds around me. That's when I saw it. A black SUV parked across the street. My stomach dropped. They'd found me. I ducked into a nearby alley, hoping to lose them in the maze of back streets. I kept moving, taking random turns, trying to shake the feeling of being hunted. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon an abandoned building. The windows were boarded up, and the door was hanging off its hinges. It was perfect. I slipped inside and found a spot to hide in the basement. The place was dark and smelled of mold and decay. I found an old mattress and collapsed onto it, too tired to care about the filth. As I lay there, I thought about the documents again. Why had I been so stupid? Why did I think I could take on something so much bigger than me? I was just a guy with a laptop and too much curiosity for my own good. Then I remembered something I hadn't thought about in days. One of the files I downloaded was a video. I hadn't watched it yet. Too afraid of what I might see, I pulled out my laptop and booted it up. My hands were shaking as I navigated to the file. It was labeled Subject 17. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the play button, but I knew I had to see it. Maybe it would give me some answers, something I could use to turn the tables. The video was grainy, like it had been recorded on an old security camera. It showed a small, windowless room with a metal chair in the center. A man was strapped to the chair, his head slumped forward. His clothes were torn, and his skin was covered in bruises and cuts. A door opened, and two men in lab coats entered. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces obscured by surgical masks. One of the men held a syringe filled with a dark, viscous liquid. He injected it into the man's arm, and almost immediately, the man began to convulse. His eyes snapped open, and he let out a blood-curdling scream. The veins in his neck and face bulged, and his skin started to turn a sickly shade of green. The convulsions grew more violent, and then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. The man went limp, his head lolling to the side. The two men in lab coats exchanged a look, and one of them nodded. They unstrapped the man from the chair and dragged him out of the room. The video ended there, but the image of the man's lifeless eyes burned into my mind. I closed my laptop and sat in the darkness, my thoughts racing. What the hell had I stumbled onto? This wasn't just about secret documents or covert operations. This was something far more sinister, something that could change everything if it got out. I needed to find a way to expose it, to make people understand the gravity of what was happening. But first, I had to survive. I couldn't let them catch me. I had to stay one step ahead, keep moving, keep hiding. I didn't know how long I could keep it up, but I had to try. For all the people who'd suffered, for all the lives ruined by Project Nightshade, I had to keep going. The next morning, I left the abandoned building and headed to a public library. I figured I could use their computers to keep researching without leaving a trace. As I walked through the door, I saw a notice on the bulletin board. It was a missing persons flyer. The face on it looked familiar. It was one of the journalists I'd sent the documents to. My blood ran cold. They were cleaning up loose ends, tying up every lead I'd tried to create. I sat down at a computer and logged in, my mind racing. I had to find a way to get the information out, to make sure it couldn't be silenced. I started drafting an email, detailing everything I'd found, everything that had happened to me. I attached the documents and the video, and sent it to every major news outlet I could think of. I didn't know if it would be enough, but it was all I could do. As I left the library, I felt a strange sense of calm. Maybe it was the knowledge that I'd done everything I could. Or maybe it was the resignation that my time was running out. Either way, I was ready for whatever came next. I just hoped that somehow, somewhere, someone would see the truth and do something about it. I left the library with a glimmer of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by the relentless fear that had become my constant companion. I knew I couldn't stay in one place for long, so I decided to keep moving, blending into the city crowds. The days began to blur together as I dodged shadows and tried to stay one step ahead of the men chasing me. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were filled with nightmarish visions of the experiments I had read about. Faces twisted in agony, bodies contorted in unnatural ways, and the ever-present sound of tortured screams. The line between reality and hallucination was growing thinner, and I was starting to lose my grip on sanity. One evening, while hiding out in a rundown bar, I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Two men in suits were sitting at the bar, speaking in low voices. I couldn't make out everything they were saying, but I caught enough to know they were talking about me. They mentioned my name, my last known location, and their orders to bring me in, alive if possible. The way they said it sent a shiver down my spine. What did they want from me? I couldn't stay there any longer. I slipped out the back door and into the alley, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed a plan, something to throw them off my trail. I remembered an old friend who lived a few cities over. We hadn't spoken in years, but he was a hacker, one of the best. If anyone could help me disappear, it was him. I managed to scrape together enough money for a bus ticket and made my way to the station. The ride was long and nerve-wracking. Every stop felt like an eternity, and I kept expecting the men in suits to board and drag me off. But they didn't, and after what felt like a lifetime, I arrived at my destination. Finding my friend Jake wasn't easy. He'd gone off the grid years ago, and his last known address was nothing more than an abandoned warehouse. But I knew his habits, his patterns, and after a few days of searching, I finally tracked him down to a secluded house on the outskirts of town. Jake was skeptical when he saw me. He'd heard about my predicament, but he wasn't sure if he wanted to get involved. I told him everything, about Project Nightshade, the men chasing me, and the video. He didn't believe me at first, but when I showed him the documents and the video, his expression changed. He knew I was telling the truth, and he agreed to help. We spent the next few days laying low, while Jake worked on creating a new identity for me. He was good, really good, and he managed to erase nearly all traces of my existence. But he also found something disturbing. The files I'd sent to the news outlets and forums had been scrubbed from the internet. Every trace of Project Nightshade had been wiped clean, as if it never existed. The reach of these people was terrifying. One night, as we were planning my next move, the power went out. Jake cursed under his breath and went to check the fuse box. I waited in the dark, the silence pressing in on me. Then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from outside the house. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and moved to the window, peeking through the curtains. My heart sank. There they were, 3 men in black suits, standing in the shadows, watching the house. They knew I was here. I ran to find Jake, but before I could reach him, the door burst open, and the men stormed in. They moved with military precision, fanning out and cutting off any escape routes. I tried to fight, but they were too strong, too fast. One of them grabbed me, slamming me to the ground and pinning my arms behind my back. Jake appeared, holding a baseball bat, but before he could swing, one of the men pulled out a gun and shot him. The sound was deafening, and I watched in horror as Jake crumpled to the floor, blood pooling around him. I screamed, struggling against my captor, but it was no use. They had me. They dragged me outside and threw me into the back of an SUV, the door slamming shut behind me. The ride was a blur of fear and confusion. My mind raced with questions. Where were they taking me? What were they going to do with me? But I had no answers. Only the cold, hard reality that I was at their mercy. After what felt like hours, the SUV came to a stop. The door opened, and I was hauled out into a dimly lit parking garage. They marched me to an elevator and took me down to what seemed like a subterranean level. The air was cold and stale, and the fluorescent lights flickered ominously. They led me to a small windowless room and shoved me inside. The door locked behind me with a heavy thud. I was alone, with nothing but my thoughts and the sound of my own breathing. Time lost all meaning. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. The fear was all-consuming, gnawing at my sanity. Eventually, the door opened, and a man walked in. He was different from the others, older, with a commanding presence. He sat down across from me, his eyes cold and calculating. "Mr. Adams," he said, his voice calm and measured, "you've caused us quite a bit of trouble, but it's over now. We know everything, and there's no one left to help you." I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all I could do was stare at him, my mind racing. He leaned forward, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "You should have left well enough alone," he said, "but you didn't, and now you're going to pay the price." He stood up and walked out, leaving me in the darkness. I knew then that this was just the beginning. They weren't going to kill me, at least not yet. They had something much worse in store. The man's words echoed in my mind long after he left. I sat in that small windowless room for what felt like an eternity. The silence was suffocating, and my thoughts were a chaotic mess of fear and regret. I had no idea what they were planning for me, but I knew it wouldn't be good. Eventually the door opened again, and two men in lab coats entered. Their faces were blank, emotionless, as if they were performing a routine task. One of them carried a tray with syringes and vials of various liquids, while the other wheeled in a metal cart with straps. "Mr. Adams," the first man said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "we need you to come with us." I tried to resist, but they were stronger. They strapped me to the cart and wheeled me out of the room, down a long, dimly lit hallway. The place felt like a maze, each turn and corridor identical to the last. Eventually, we arrived at a large, sterile room filled with medical equipment. They moved me to a metal table and strapped me down. The lights above were blinding, and the hum of machines filled the air. I struggled against the restraints, but it was useless. The men worked quickly, attaching electrodes to my temples and inserting an IV into my arm. The second man prepared a syringe filled with a dark, ominous liquid. "Relax, Mr. Adams," he said, as if that was even possible. "This will be over soon." I felt a cold dread wash over me as the needle pierced my skin. The liquid burned as it entered my bloodstream, sending waves of pain through my body. My vision blurred, and I felt my consciousness slipping away. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the sound of their voices, speaking in hushed tones. When I woke up, I was back in the small room, but something was different. My head throbbed, and my body felt heavy, unresponsive. I tried to move, but my limbs wouldn't cooperate. Panic set in as I realized I was completely paralyzed. The door opened, and the older man from before walked in, followed by a doctor. They looked down at me with cold detachment. "Good to see you awake, Mr. Adams," the older man said. "You've been out for quite a while. We had to make some adjustments." He gestured to the doctor, who began checking my vitals and making notes on a clipboard. The older man continued, his tone almost conversational. "You see, Mr. Adams, you stumbled onto something you were never meant to see. Project Nightshade is only the tip of the iceberg. There are things in this world that must remain hidden for the good of everyone. You threaten that balance, and now we have to ensure you can't do any more damage." I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all I could do was lie there, helpless and terrified. The older man leaned closer, his eyes boring into mine. "We're going to conduct some experiments, Mr. Adams. You've become a valuable test subject, and your suffering will serve a greater purpose." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving me alone with the doctor. The next few days were a blur of pain and confusion. They kept me sedated most of the time, but I had moments of clarity where I was acutely aware of what was happening. They injected me with various chemicals, monitored my brain activity, and recorded my responses. The pain was excruciating, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. One night, during a rare moment of consciousness, I overheard a conversation between two doctors. They were discussing the results of their experiments, the effects of the neurotoxin on my brain. I realized they were using me to perfect the same methods they had used on the subjects in the Project Nightshade documents. They were turning me into a living experiment, a puppet controlled by their twisted science. Days turned into weeks, and the torture continued. I lost track of time, my sense of reality slipping away. The faces of the men in suits, the doctors, and the older man all blurred together in a nightmarish haze. I was trapped in a hellish cycle of pain and despair, with no hope of escape. Then, one night, something changed. The older man came to see me again, but this time he looked different. There was a hint of frustration in his eyes, a crack in his calm facade. "Mr. Adams," he said, his voice strained, "it seems we have a problem. Despite our best efforts, someone has taken an interest in your case. There are people looking for you, people we can't easily silence." For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope ignited in my chest. Maybe someone had seen my emails, maybe the truth was getting out. But the older man quickly snuffed out that hope with his next words. "We're moving you to a more secure location," he said. "Your cooperation is no longer optional." They drugged me again, and when I woke up, I was in a different facility. This one was even more sterile and foreboding than the last. They kept me isolated, the only human contact being the doctors who came to perform their experiments. The older man visited less frequently, but when he did, his frustration was palpable. One night, during one of his visits, I managed to speak, my voice weak and raspy. "Why are you doing this?" I croaked. He looked at me, a mixture of pity and anger in his eyes. "Because, Mr. Adams, there are things in this world that must be controlled, kept in check. You forced our hand, and now you're paying the price." He left me alone, my mind racing. I realized then that they weren't just experimenting on me, they were trying to break me, to erase any trace of who I was. They wanted to turn me into another faceless victim of their dark secrets, but I refused to let them win. I clung to the hope that someone, somewhere would find me, would expose the truth. I had to believe that my suffering wasn't in vain, that there was still a chance for justice. As the days dragged on, I grew weaker, my body and mind battered by the relentless torture. But my spirit remained unbroken. I knew that as long as I held on to that hope, I still had a chance. And maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to turn the tables on my captors and bring their dark secrets to light. The days and nights blended into an indistinguishable haze of torment and fleeting moments of lucidity. Every time I opened my eyes, I found myself in the same sterile white room, the beeping machines and distant murmurs of the doctors my only company. I was barely hanging on, my body ached, and my mind teetered on the edge of collapse. But through the fog of my suffering, I clung to one thought: survival. One evening, the older man, whom I now knew as Dr. Harris, came to see me again. His frustration had grown into something darker, more desperate. He stood over me, his eyes cold and calculating. "Mr. Adams, your resilience is remarkable," he said, almost begrudgingly. "But it's time to put an end to this. We have more pressing matters to attend to." He signaled to the two men who always accompanied him. They unstrapped me from the table and hoisted me to my feet. My legs were weak, barely able to support my weight. They dragged me down a long, dimly lit corridor and into a large, ominous room filled with advanced equipment that looked straight out of a science fiction nightmare. "Prepare him for the final phase," Dr. Harris ordered. As they secured me to another metal table, I realized that this was it. Whatever they were planning, it was the end game. My heart pounded in my chest, and I struggled against the restraints, but it was no use. The machines around me hummed to life, and a large screen flickered on, displaying a complex array of data and images. The doctors began their work, injecting me with more chemicals, attaching electrodes to my head, and setting up various monitors. I felt a sharp pain in my temples as they inserted something deep into my brain. My vision blurred, and a high-pitched ringing filled my ears. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. The machines powered down, and the hum of electricity ceased. The emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie red glow over everything. Dr. Harris cursed under his breath and barked orders to the other men. "What's happening?" one of the doctors asked, panic creeping into his voice. "Someone's breached the system," Dr. Harris snapped. "Find out who and stop them." As chaos erupted around me, I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was my chance. Someone had found me, and they were trying to save me. I focused all my strength on the restraints, tugging and pulling with everything I had. The leather straps bit into my skin, but I didn't care. I had to get free. The lights flickered again, and the door to the room burst open. A group of armed men in tactical gear stormed in, shouting commands. Dr. Harris and his team backed away, their faces pale with fear. "Get down on the ground, now!" one of the men shouted. Dr. Harris glared at me, his eyes filled with hatred. "This isn't over, Mr. Adams," he hissed, before dropping to his knees. One of the armed men approached me and quickly released the restraints. "Are you Matt Adams?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. He helped me to my feet, supporting my weight as I stumbled. "You're safe now," he said. "We're getting you out of here." The next few hours were a blur of movement and noise. They led me out of the facility and into the back of a van. I was surrounded by people, all speaking in urgent tones, but I couldn't focus on their words. My mind was reeling, struggling to process what was happening. Eventually, the van came to a stop, and they brought me to a safe house. It was a small, unassuming place, but it felt like a palace compared to the sterile nightmare I'd just escaped from. They gave me food, water, and medical attention. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The man who had freed me, Captain Miller, sat down beside me. "You did good, kid," he said. "We got your message. It took a while, but we finally tracked you down. The information you sent out, it's already being disseminated. People are waking up to the truth." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Despite everything, my efforts hadn't been in vain. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice weak. "Now," Captain Miller said. "We keep you safe. You'll need to lay low for a while, but we've got people who can help you start a new life. And don't worry, Dr. Harris and his team won't be able to hurt anyone else. We have enough evidence to bring them down for good." As I lay in the bed that night, I thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the pain, the horror of Project Nightshade. It would take a long time to recover, both physically and mentally, but I knew I had to keep going. There were still secrets to uncover, still battles to fight, but for now, I could rest, knowing that I had made a difference. The nightmare was far from over, but I had survived, and as long as I was alive, I would keep fighting, for the truth, for justice, and for all the people who had suffered in silence. This is Matt Adams, signing off. If you're reading this, stay vigilant, trust no one, and never stop searching for the truth. I've always been fascinated by conspiracy theories, not because I believe in them, but because of the sheer insanity some of them carry. It's like watching a train wreck. You just can't look away. So, naturally, my curiosity got the best of me one night, and I decided to dive into the dark web. I wanted to see just how deep the rabbit hole went. I started with the basics: forums discussing black market items, fake IDs, and hackers offering their services. It was thrilling and unnerving at the same time, but then I stumbled across a forum with a thread titled, "Government Leaked Docs, Alien Contact." The title itself was laughable, but the number of comments and the intensity of the discussion drew me in. People were swearing it was real, and that the documents contained undeniable proof of extraterrestrial life. I was skeptical, but I couldn't resist. I clicked the link, which took me to an encrypted site. After some back and forth with a few sketchy characters in the forum, I managed to get access to the documents. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I opened the first file. It started innocuously enough: reports from supposed government agencies about unidentified flying objects, oddities that could easily be dismissed as weather balloons or advanced military aircraft. But the further I read, the darker and more twisted the content became. One document was a transcript of an interrogation. The subject was a man who claimed to have been abducted by aliens. He described in horrifying detail the things they did to him: the probing, the experiments, the cold, sterile environment of the spacecraft. He spoke of pain beyond comprehension, of devices inserted into his body in ways that made my skin crawl. His words were graphic, describing the physical violations with an unsettling precision. The worst part was how he talked about the aliens themselves. Humanoid, but with features so grotesque they seemed pulled from a nightmare. Eyes that glowed a sickening yellow, skin like rotting leather, and fingers ending in sharp surgical instruments. I could feel my stomach turning, but I pressed on. Another file contained images. Blurry at first, but then sharper, more detailed. Photos of what could only be described as autopsies. Human bodies, or what was left of them, laid out on metal tables. Their chests and skulls were opened, revealing organs that were charred and twisted, as if subjected to extreme heat or some unknown energy. The expressions on their faces were frozen in agony, eyes wide and mouths open in silent screams. I started to feel sick, but I couldn't stop reading. The next document was a report on a facility supposedly hidden in the Nevada desert. It detailed experiments conducted on both humans and aliens. The descriptions were nightmarish. Live dissections, genetic splicing, and the creation of hybrid creatures. The text was accompanied by more images. Mutated fetuses in jars. Creatures that looked like they belonged in a horror movie. Some had the familiar features of the aliens from the interrogation transcript, while others were grotesque combinations of human and alien DNA. The final document was a video file. My hands were shaking as I clicked play. The footage was grainy, taken from what looked like a security camera inside the facility. It showed a group of people in lab coats gathered around a table. On the table was a figure, struggling against restraints. It was human, or at least it had been. The figure was covered in scars and fresh wounds, eyes darting wildly with terror. The people in lab coats ignored its pleas for help, speaking to each other in hushed tones. They began to cut into the figure, their movements methodical and unfeeling. The screams that came from the figure were unlike anything I'd ever heard. Raw, primal, filled with a pain that went beyond the physical. I slammed my laptop shut, bile rising in my throat. I ran to the bathroom, barely making it to the toilet before I vomited. My mind was racing, filled with the horrific images and sounds I had just witnessed. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sick joke, right? But the more I thought about it, the more it felt real. Too real. The details, the documents, the way everything was laid out. It was too elaborate to be a hoax. I sat on the bathroom floor, shaking uncontrollably. I had delved too deep, seen too much, and now I couldn't unsee it. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the images from the documents, heard the screams from the video. I felt like I was being watched, like at any moment, someone or something would come for me. I knew I had to tell someone, but who would believe me? Who could I trust? The next morning, I woke up to find my laptop missing. The door to my apartment was still locked, and there were no signs of a break-in. My heart pounded as I searched every corner of my place, but it was gone. Panic set in. Had they found me? Was I next on their list of experiments? I knew one thing for sure. I had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. But first, I had to survive. I spent the next few days in a state of paranoid frenzy. Every sound outside my apartment, every creak of the floorboards, made my heart race. I knew I had to get out of there. Staying put was like painting a target on my back. But where could I go? And who could I trust? I decided to reach out to an old friend from college, Tom. We hadn't spoken in years, but he was one of the few people I knew who had the skills and the mindset to help me. Tom was a hacker, and a damn good one at that. If anyone could help me make sense of what I found, it was him. I sent him a cryptic message, asking to meet in person. We arranged to meet at a secluded diner on the outskirts of town, a place where nobody would think to look for me. I packed a bag with essentials and left my apartment, hoping to leave no trail. When I arrived at the diner, Tom was already there, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up as I slid into the booth across from him, his eyes widening as he took in my disheveled appearance. "Damn, man, you look like you've seen a ghost," he said, half joking. I gave a weak smile. "You have no idea." Over the next hour, I told Tom everything. About the dark web forum, the documents, the video. His expression grew graver with each detail. When I finished, he leaned back, letting out a low whistle. "That's some heavy shit," he said. "But it doesn't surprise me. I've heard whispers about this kind of stuff before. People disappearing, strange experiments, but nothing this detailed. I don't know what to do," I admitted. "I feel like they're watching me, like they're waiting to make their move. Tom nodded, his eyes scanning the diner. First things first, we need to cover your tracks, get a new phone, ditch any devices they could trace. And we need to dig deeper. If those documents are real, there has to be more out there. We left the diner separately, agreeing to meet at a motel a few miles away. Tom had a friend who could get us new phones and some basic hacking gear. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and preparation. Tom worked tirelessly, using his skills to find any information that could help us. One night, as we were holed up in the motel room, Tom's eyes lit up with excitement. "I found something," he said, gesturing for me to come over. He had accessed a secure server, filled with files even more disturbing than the ones I had seen. These documents detailed a shadowy government organization known as Section 31. They operated outside the bounds of any known laws, answering only to the highest levels of power. Their sole purpose was to study and weaponize alien technology. The files contained lists of people they had abducted, locations of secret facilities, and reports on various subjects they had experimented on. One report stood out. It detailed a failed experiment involving a hybrid creature. The creature had broken free from its containment and gone on a rampage, killing several scientists before being subdued. The description of the creature was chilling, a monstrous fusion of human and alien DNA, with elongated limbs, razor-sharp teeth, and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. As we read through the files, a pattern began to emerge. Section 31 wasn't just experimenting with alien technology, they were preparing for something. There were references to Project Ascendancy, a cryptic initiative that seemed to involve mass abductions and genetic manipulation on a global scale. The implications were terrifying. Tom and I knew we had to expose this, but we also knew the risks. Section 31 had eyes everywhere, and they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who got too close to the truth. We had to be smart, careful. The next day, we decided to visit one of the locations mentioned in the documents, a supposed abandoned facility in the desert. If we could find concrete evidence, maybe we could blow this thing wide open. We drove through the night, arriving at the facility just before dawn. It was a dilapidated building, surrounded by barbed wire and warning signs. As we approached, I felt a sense of foreboding. This place held secrets, dark and terrible. We managed to find a way in, slipping through a gap in the fence. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Broken equipment and discarded papers littered the floor. We made our way through the building, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. Then we found it, a hidden lab, buried deep underground. The lab was in disarray, as if abandoned in a hurry, but the equipment was still there, and so were the records. We sifted through the files, finding more evidence of the horrific experiments conducted here. As we were about to leave, we heard a noise, footsteps, echoing through the corridors. My heart pounded in my chest as we ducked behind a table. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I held my breath, praying we wouldn't be found. A group of men entered the lab, their faces obscured by masks. They moved with military precision, scanning the room. One of them spoke into a radio. "We've secured the area. Begin extraction." Tom and I exchanged a terrified glance. We had to get out, now. But as we made our way to the exit, one of the men spotted us. "Hey, stop!" We ran, adrenaline fueling our escape. The men gave chase, their shouts echoing in the halls. We burst out of the building, sprinting towards our car. Bullets whizzed past us, kicking up dust and debris. We managed to reach the car and sped away, my heart pounding in my chest. As we drove, I looked back, seeing the men disappear into the distance. We had narrowly escaped, but I knew they wouldn't stop. They would come for us, and they wouldn't rest until we were silenced. Tom and I knew we had to go deeper into hiding, but we also knew we couldn't give up. We had to find a way to expose Section 31 and their horrific experiments. The world needed to know the truth, no matter the cost. The drive away from the facility was a blur of fear and adrenaline. Tom and I knew we were in deep now, and there was no turning back. We needed to find a place to lay low and regroup. After driving for hours, we found a seedy motel on the outskirts of a small town, far enough off the beaten path that we hoped it would buy us some time. We checked in under fake names and barricaded ourselves in the room, exhausted but too wired to sleep. Tom immediately set up his laptop, using a series of VPNs and encryption tools to make sure we couldn't be traced. I paced the room, trying to process everything we'd seen. "What now?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination. Tom looked up, his face grim. We need to get this information to someone who can help us expose it. Journalists, activists, anyone with a platform big enough to make a difference. But we need to be careful. If Section 31 finds us first. He didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew what would happen if they caught us. Over the next few days, we worked tirelessly, sifting through the files we'd taken from the facility and piecing together the horrifying puzzle. The more we uncovered, the more monstrous Section 31's plans became. They were not only preparing for some kind of alien incursion, but also experimenting with mind control and genetic manipulation on a scale that defied comprehension. One night, as we were deep into our research, the power in our motel room suddenly went out. The room plunged into darkness and my heart skipped a beat. Tom, what the hell is going on? He was already on his feet, moving to the window. He pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. Shit. I think they found us. Panic surged through me. What do we do? We need to move, now. Tom grabbed the laptop and the hard drives we had copied the files onto. We stuffed our things into our bags and slipped out the back door, keeping to the shadows. As we made our way to the car, I could see black SUVs pulling into the motel parking lot, men in dark suits fanning out and heading towards our room. We drove in silence, the tension between us palpable. We needed a new plan, fast. There's an old safe house I know about, Tom said finally. It's off the grid, a place where we can lay low and figure out our next move. The safe house was a cabin deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. It was a relic from Tom's hacking days, a place he'd used when he needed to disappear. We arrived just as dawn was breaking, the sky tinged with the first light of morning. The cabin was small and rustic, but it had everything we needed. Food, water, and most importantly, a secure internet connection. We spent the next few days in a state of constant vigilance, alternating between researching and keeping watch. The more we dug into the files, the more we realized just how deep Section 31's influence ran. They had their fingers in everything. Politics, media, even law enforcement. It felt like we were up against an unstoppable force. Then we found something that made our blood run cold. Hidden deep within the files was a list of names. People who had been abducted and experimented on, just like the man in the interrogation transcript. But what was more disturbing were the notes beside each name. They detailed the various enhancements and modifications made to each individual, turning them into something more than human, something monstrous. One name stood out, Jessica Miller. She was listed as Subject 37B, and the notes indicated she had undergone extensive genetic modifications. The last entry mentioned that she had escaped the facility and was considered highly dangerous. There was a photo attached, a haunting image of a woman with eyes that seemed to pierce through the screen, filled with a mixture of fear and rage. "We need to find her," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If she's still out there, she might be the key to exposing all of this." Finding Jessica wasn't going to be easy. Section 31 had likely covered their tracks, making her disappear just like they had with so many others. But we had to try. We spent hours combing through online forums, news articles, and any other sources we could find. Finally, we caught a break. A recent news story from a small town a few hundred miles away reported strange sightings of a woman matching Jessica's description. The locals spoke of a ghostly figure seen lurking around the outskirts of town, a woman who seemed to vanish whenever anyone got too close. It was a lead, and it was all we had. We packed up our things and set out, hoping we weren't too late. The drive was long and tense, every car that passed us feeling like a potential threat. When we arrived in the town, we kept a low profile, asking discreet questions and trying to track down any clues about Jessica's whereabouts. One night, as we were staking out an old abandoned house on the edge of town, we saw her. She moved with an almost otherworldly grace, slipping through the shadows like a wraith. We followed her at a distance, careful not to spook her. She led us to an old barn, and as she stepped inside, we knew this was our chance. We approached cautiously, our hearts pounding. Inside the barn, Jessica was huddled in a corner, her eyes wild with fear. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "We're here to help," Tom said gently, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "We know what happened to you. We want to expose the people who did this." For a moment, she looked like she might run, but then she slumped to the ground, tears streaming down her face. You don't know what they did to me, she whispered, her voice filled with anguish. The things they made me do. We sat with her for hours, listening to her harrowing tale. She spoke of the experiments, the pain, the loss of her humanity. She told us about the others, people like her who had been twisted and transformed into living weapons. And she spoke of Project Ascendancy, a plan to unleash these abominations on the world in a bid for ultimate control. We have to stop them, she said, her voice filled with a steely determination. No matter what it takes. We knew she was right. The three of us were the only hope of exposing Section 31 and stopping their monstrous plans. But as we prepared for the battle ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already in over our heads. The darkness we were up against was deeper and more insidious than anything we could have imagined, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed us all. We spent the next few days holed up in the barn with Jessica, strategizing our next move. The more we learned from her, the more the weight of our mission pressed down on us. Jessica wasn't just a victim. She was a living, breathing testament to the horrors Section 31 was capable of. Jessica had managed to salvage a small laptop during her escape, filled with files she'd stolen from the facility. These files were the key to understanding Project Ascendancy and, hopefully, stopping it. Tom worked around the clock, decrypting and analyzing the data. As he did, Jessica and I kept watch, ensuring we remained hidden from prying eyes. One night, while Tom was buried in his work, Jessica and I sat outside the barn, the night air cool and still. She looked up at the stars, her expression distant. Do you ever think about what's out there? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. More often than I'd like to admit. She sighed. Before all this, I used to dream about the stars. Now, all I see are nightmares. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her trauma. We were silent for a moment, lost in our thoughts, until Tom's voice broke through the stillness. I've got something. We hurried inside, gathering around the laptop. Tom's face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. These files detail everything. Project Ascendancy isn't just about creating hybrids. It's about creating an army. They're planning a coordinated attack, using these things to destabilize governments, incite chaos. It's a full-scale invasion, and it's set to happen soon. A chill ran down my spine. How soon? Days, maybe a week at most, Tom replied. We need to get this information out now. We knew we couldn't just post the files online. Section 31's reach was too vast. They'd shut it down before it gained any traction. We needed to find a way to get the information to someone who could blow the lid off this operation in a big, public way. Someone they couldn't silence so easily. Journalists, Jessica suggested. High-profile ones. The kind that can't be bought or intimidated. We compiled a list of potential contacts. Investigative reporters known for their integrity and courage. It was a long shot, but it was our best chance. Tom began reaching out, sending encrypted messages with snippets of the files, hoping to catch someone's attention without alerting Section 31. As we waited for a response, Jessica and I took turns keeping watch, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound made my heart race. The nights were the worst, filled with shadows that seemed to move and eyes that I was sure were watching us. On the third night, just as dawn was beginning to break, we got a reply. An investigative journalist named Emily Hayes had taken the bait. She wanted to meet, but she insisted on a public place, a bustling cafe in a nearby city. It was risky, but we had no choice. We drove to the city, keeping to back roads and avoiding main highways. The cafe was crowded, filled with the hum of morning commuters. We spotted Emily sitting at a corner table, her eyes scanning the room nervously. We approached her cautiously, Jessica staying close to my side. You must be Emily, I said, extending a hand. She shook it, her grip firm. You've got some guts, reaching out to me like this. Now, tell me everything. We spent the next hour laying it all out. The documents, the experiments, Project Ascendancy. Emily's face grew paler with each detail, but she never looked away. When we finished, she leaned back, taking a deep breath. This is big. Bigger than anything I've ever covered. But you realize the danger you're in, right? They'll come after you, after all of us. We know, Jessica said quietly, but we don't have a choice. Emily nodded, her expression resolute. I'll get this out there. But we need to move fast. Get somewhere safe. I'll be in touch. We left the cafe, a glimmer of hope piercing through the darkness that had consumed us. But that hope was short-lived. As we made our way back to the car, I noticed a black SUV parked nearby, its windows tinted. "Tom," I whispered urgently, "we've been made." He glanced over, his face tightening. "Run." We bolted, weaving through the crowded streets, the SUV roaring to life behind us. People shouted in surprise and anger as we shoved past them, desperate to escape. We ducked into an alley, but the SUV skidded to a halt at the entrance, men in dark suits spilling out. "Go!" Tom shouted, pushing me and Jessica forward. We ran, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The alley opened onto another street, and we dashed across it, disappearing into another alleyway. But the men were relentless, their footsteps echoing behind us. We reached the end of the alley, only to find a dead end. "Shit," I muttered, panic rising. Tom pulled out a small device from his bag, a makeshift EMP generator he'd rigged together. "Get ready to run," he said, his voice steely. As the men closed in, Tom activated the device. A burst of static filled the air, and the streetlights flickered and died. The men stumbled, momentarily disoriented. We took our chance and sprinted past them, disappearing into the maze of alleyways. We didn't stop running until we were sure we'd lost them. We found refuge in an abandoned warehouse, collapsing onto the cold concrete floor, gasping for breath. Tom's face was pale, his hands shaking. "We need to keep moving. They won't stop until they find us." As we sat there, trying to catch our breath, a realization hit me. This was our life now, a constant fight for survival, running from shadows. But we couldn't give up. We had to keep going, keep fighting. Because if we didn't, the horrors of Section 31 would be unleashed upon the world, and there would be no escape. We were in the eye of the storm, and the darkness was closing in. We stayed hidden in the warehouse until nightfall, trying to catch our breath and plan our next move. The constant running and the fear gnawed at our nerves, but we couldn't afford to stop. Not when we were so close. Emily had promised to get our story out, but we needed to stay alive long enough to see it happen. That night, we made our way to a safe house Tom knew of, deep in the woods. It was a small, secluded cabin that offered a brief respite from the relentless chase. We secured the place as best we could, setting up makeshift alarms and barricades. Then we huddled inside, exhaustion finally catching up with us. As we sat around the small fireplace, Jessica spoke up, her voice a haunted whisper. "We need to be ready. They won't stop until they have us." Tom nodded, his expression grim. "We have to assume they'll find us eventually. We need a plan for when that happens." We spent the next few days in a tense vigil, taking turns keeping watch, while Tom continued to communicate with Emily. She was working tirelessly, gathering more evidence, preparing to release the story in a way that couldn't be suppressed. Each day felt like a lifetime, the fear and anticipation building with every passing hour. On the third night, the quiet was shattered by the sound of engines. Bright lights pierced the darkness, illuminating the cabin. "They're here," Tom said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Get ready." We grabbed what little gear we had and bolted for the back door, slipping into the dense forest. The men were close behind, their shouts echoing through the trees. We ran blindly, the forest a blur of shadows and movement. I could hear Jessica's ragged breathing beside me, the panic in her eyes mirroring my own. Then, the forest opened up into a clearing and we stumbled to a halt, trapped. The men were closing in, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Over here!" one of them shouted, and I could see the glint of weapons in the moonlight. Desperation surged through me. "Tom, what do we do?" He looked around, his mind racing. "There," he pointed to an old, decrepit shack at the edge of the clearing. "We can make a stand there." We sprinted to the shack, barricading ourselves inside. The men were almost upon us, their footsteps thundering outside. "We can't hold them off forever," Jessica whispered, fear lacing her voice. Tom was already setting up his laptop, connecting to Emily one last time. "We just need to buy some time," he said, his fingers flying over the keys. "Emily's ready to go public. We need to give her the final push." As the men began pounding on the door, Tom sent the last of the files to Emily, along with a message. "Do it now." He turned to us, his face set with determination. "We're going to make sure they don't get to her." The door splintered and the men burst in, guns drawn. "Hands up!" one of them shouted. "You're coming with us," Tom stepped forward, holding up his hands. "You're too late. It's already out," the man sneered. "We'll see about that." He motioned for his men to grab us, but before they could, the room was filled with the deafening roar of an explosion. The men were thrown back, chaos erupting around us. Through the smoke and confusion, I saw Jessica, holding a small detonator. "We can't let them take us," she said, her voice resolute. "Not after everything." We took advantage of the chaos, slipping out of the shack and into the forest once more. Behind us, the flames lit up the night, casting long, flickering shadows. We ran, our lungs burning, our bodies aching, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. We kept running until we reached the highway, where we flagged down a passing car. The driver, a kind old man, didn't ask questions, just saw our desperation and agreed to take us as far as he could. As we drove, Tom's phone buzzed with a message from Emily. "It's done. The story's out. They can't stop it now." Relief washed over us, mingling with the exhaustion and fear. We had done it. We had exposed Section 31, but we knew this was only the beginning. The fight was far from over, and we would be hunted for the rest of our lives. But for now, we had won a small victory. As the car sped down the highway, I looked at Jessica and Tom, my comrades in this nightmare. We were bonded by our shared trauma, our shared fight. And as long as we were together, we had a chance. We would keep running, keep fighting, because the darkness was still out there. But now, the world knew the truth, and that was a start. In the end, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about making sure the horrors we had witnessed would never happen again. And for that, we were willing to sacrifice everything. All right, so I need to get this off my chest because it's been eating me alive. You see these posts about people exploring the dark web, and it always seems like some fun, spooky tale. But what happened to me? It's beyond terrifying, and it's real. I'm not some thrill seeker. I was just a regular guy, a tech nerd with a curiosity that got the best of me. I'd heard about the dark web, whispered stories of illicit sites, black markets, and more sinister things lurking in its shadows. One night, after a couple of beers, I decided to dive in, just to see what it was like. I didn't plan on doing anything crazy, just browsing, you know? I downloaded Tor, made sure I was behind a VPN, and started exploring. It was a rush at first, this hidden part of the internet that felt like a forbidden world. I came across the usual stuff: drug markets, counterfeit money, shady services. But then I found this site. No name, just a black screen with a chat box and a single line of text. "Do you want to see something you can never unsee?" I should have closed the browser right there, but curiosity is a hell of a drug. I typed "yes" and hit enter. The screen flickered and then a video window opened. It was grainy, like those old VHS tapes, and it showed a room with dim, flickering lights. The camera was static, fixed on this filthy, blood-stained mattress in the center of the room. Then, this figure walked in. Hooded, face obscured. They carried something in their arms. A bundle, maybe a blanket. They dropped it on the mattress, and I saw it wasn't a blanket. It was a person, or what was left of one. I can't even begin to describe the state they were in, but it was clear they'd been through hell. I slammed my laptop shut, heart racing, feeling sick to my stomach. I didn't sleep that night. The image of that person haunted me, their lifeless eyes, the horror etched into their features. For days, I tried to convince myself it was fake, some sick prank, a staged video, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was real. Then the nightmares started. I'd see that room, that mattress, wake up drenched in sweat, feeling like I was being watched. It was eating away at me. About a week after that night, I was heading home from work. It was late, the streets were empty, and I felt this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder but saw nothing. Just as I was about to brush it off, I felt a sharp pain at the back of my head, and everything went black. When I came to, I was in my bed. My apartment looked exactly the same. Nothing seemed out of place, except for one thing. My phone showed the date. I'd lost 2 years. 2 fucking years of my life. just gone. My hair was longer, my beard unkempt, but I remembered nothing. It was like I'd just fallen asleep and woken up 2 years later. My first thought was to call someone, anyone. But who do you call in a situation like this? I ended up at my parents' house. When they opened the door, they looked at me like they'd seen a ghost. My mom burst into tears. My dad just stared, speechless. They told me I'd gone missing. They'd filed a police report, hired private investigators, but I'd vanished without a trace. They assumed I was dead, but I was there, standing right in front of them, with no memory of what happened. The police questioned me, but I had nothing to tell them. No leads, no clues. I tried to piece my life back together, but things weren't right. I'd wake up in strange places covered in dirt or blood, with no memory of how I got there. My mind felt fractured, like there were parts of me missing. Then I started seeing them. The hooded figures, always in the corner of my eye, watching, waiting. The scariest part? I found a new scar on my chest, right above my heart. It wasn't there before. It looked like a symbol, something I couldn't quite make out. But I knew it wasn't random. It was a mark, a brand. And every time I looked at it, I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I don't know what happened to me during those 2 years, but I'm scared to find out. I can feel them watching, waiting for something. I don't know if I can trust my own mind anymore. All I know is that I'm not alone, and whatever it is, it's coming for me. I went on the dark web, and now my life is a living nightmare. If you're reading this, take my advice. Stay away from that place. Days turned into weeks, and I was barely holding it together. My family tried to help, but they couldn't understand what I was going through. How could they? I couldn't even understand it myself. I felt like a stranger in my own skin. Every day was a battle against the gnawing anxiety, the paranoia that crept into every moment. I decided to see a therapist. Maybe talking about it would help, I thought. Dr. Reynolds was kind, patient, and genuinely seemed to want to help. I told him everything, from the dark web to my lost 2 years. He listened, took notes, but his eyes betrayed a hint of skepticism. The sessions were intense. He'd ask me to recount my last memory before waking up in my bed, then push me to delve deeper, to try and remember anything. Each session felt like pulling teeth. I started getting flashes, brief, disjointed images that made no sense. Dark rooms, the sound of dripping water, muffled screams. My own voice, begging, pleading, but I couldn't remember why. One night, I woke up at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat. The nightmares were getting worse. I saw myself in that room again, but this time, I wasn't just a spectator. I was on that mattress, bound, screaming. The hooded figure was there, whispering something I couldn't quite hear. My heart raced as I tried to catch my breath. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and then I woke up. I needed answers. My therapist suggested hypnosis, a way to unlock those hidden memories. I was desperate, willing to try anything. The first session was unnerving. I felt myself slipping into a trance, my mind wandering to dark places. I saw flashes of those 2 years, but nothing concrete. Just fragmented memories, like pieces of a shattered mirror. After a few sessions, things started to get clearer. I remembered being in a small, windowless room, chained to a wall. The hooded figure visited me regularly, whispering in a language I didn't understand. They'd inject me with something, and I'd drift in and out of consciousness. I remembered other people there too, all in similar states of disarray, their eyes hollow and vacant. One memory stood out. It was the last thing I saw before waking up in my bed. I was lying on that blood-stained mattress, the hooded figure standing over me. They had a scalpel in their hand, and they were carving something into my chest. The pain was excruciating, and I could feel every cut, every slice of the blade. They were speaking in that strange language again, and I realized they were chanting, performing some kind of ritual. When I snapped out of the hypnosis, I was shaking. Dr. Reynolds looked pale. "We need to go deeper," he said. "There's more there, I can feel it. But we need to be careful." I agreed, but the fear was gnawing at me. What if I didn't like what I found? What if those memories were too much to bear? But I couldn't live like this, with this void in my mind, this constant fear. The next session, I was more determined. I focused, let myself drift deeper into my subconscious. The images came faster, clearer. I saw myself escaping. There was a riot, people screaming, fighting back. I saw blood. So much blood. I remembered finding a way out, running through dark corridors, stumbling into the night. But the most disturbing memory came last. I was free, running through the woods, when I saw the hooded figure again. They didn't chase me, they just stood there, watching, whispering those same words. And then I felt it. A sharp pain in my neck, and everything went black. When I woke up in my bed, the memory of that escape felt like a dream. But the scar on my chest was real. I realized that whatever they'd done to me, it wasn't over. They'd let me go for a reason, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. I started noticing things around my apartment. Small, subtle changes. A book moved, a drawer left slightly open. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but then I found a note under my pillow. It was a single handwritten word, soon. I showed it to Dr. Reynolds, and he suggested I go to the police. But what could they do? I had no proof, just fragmented memories and a scar. I felt like I was losing my mind. That night, I set up a camera in my room, determined to catch whoever was messing with me. I fell asleep with the camera rolling, but when I reviewed the footage the next morning, it was gone. The camera was still there, but the memory card was missing. Then I found another note, this time on my bathroom mirror. You can't escape. I was trapped in my own personal hell, and there was no way out. The hooded figures were coming for me, and I was powerless to stop them. The fear was consuming me, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they made their next move. I just hoped I'd be ready when they did. Sleep became a thing from a fairy tale. Every night was a battle against the terror that gripped my mind. The hooded figures were always there, lurking in the shadows of my dreams, whispering in that eerie language. The messages kept coming too. I'd find them in the most unexpected places, tucked into my wallet, slipped under my door, even on my car windshield, each one more cryptic and sinister than the last. One day I found a note inside my fridge, written in what looked like blood. Remember the sacrifice. I dropped the note, my hands shaking. The word sacrifice sent chills down my spine. What had I done? What had they made me do during those lost 2 years? Dr. Reynolds suggested I take a break from our sessions, fearing that I was getting too close to something my mind wasn't ready to handle. But I couldn't stop. I needed answers, no matter how horrifying they might be. That night, I decided to confront my fears. I barricaded myself in my apartment, determined to stay awake and catch whoever was tormenting me. I armed myself with a baseball bat and sat in the living room, waiting. Hours passed, and just as my eyelids grew heavy, I heard it, a faint whisper coming from my bedroom. Gripping the bat tightly, I crept towards the sound. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I saw a figure standing by my bed. The hooded figure. They turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw their eyes. They were empty black voids that seemed to swallow the light. I swung the bat, but my arms felt heavy, sluggish. The figure didn't flinch. They just stood there, watching, whispering. The room grew colder, and I felt a pressure in my chest, like something was squeezing the life out of me. My vision blurred, and I heard their voice in my head, clear and unmistakable. Remember. The next thing I knew, I was on the floor, gasping for air. The figure was gone, but the words lingered in my mind. I had to remember. But what? The next morning, I found another note, this one pinned to my bedroom wall. The basement. I didn't have a basement. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a complex. But the message was clear. There was something I needed to find, and it was hidden away, deep below. I started investigating my building, looking for any sign of a hidden basement. The superintendent was no help, insisting there was no basement. But I knew better. There had to be something. I combed through old blueprints and finally found it. A sealed-off section in the basement marked storage. Breaking into the basement was easier than I thought. The lock was old, rusted. Inside, it was pitch black, and the air was thick with mold and decay. I found a light switch, but it only flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The room was filled with old furniture, broken appliances, and stacks of dusty boxes. In the corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A row of old videotapes, each labeled with a date. The date spanned the 2 years I was missing. My hands trembled as I picked up the first tape. I had to know what was on them. Back in my apartment, I dusted off an old VCR I'd found in the basement and slid in the first tape. The screen crackled to life, and there I was, lying on that blood-stained mattress. The camera was fixed, just like the video I'd seen on the dark web. The hooded figure was there, chanting, carving into my chest. I felt bile rise in my throat. The tapes documented everything, every moment of those 2 years. The tortures, the rituals, the experiments. I saw myself being drugged, cut, branded. I saw other people too, all subjected to the same horrors. Some didn't survive. The hooded figures performed unspeakable acts, and I was a part of it. I wasn't just a victim. I was a participant. One tape stood out. It was labeled Initiation. I watched in horror as the hooded figures forced me to perform the same rituals on others. My hands covered in blood, my voice chanting those same words. I was one of them. I couldn't believe it. They'd broken me, turned me into one of their own, and then, for some reason, they let me go. Or maybe I escaped. The details were blurry, but it didn't matter. I was a part of this, whether I wanted to be or not. I felt a rage building inside me. They'd taken everything from me, my life, my sanity. I wasn't going to let them win. I decided to go back to the basement to find more evidence, something I could use to bring them down. But when I got there, the basement was empty. The tapes, the furniture, everything was gone. The walls were bare, the air stale. It was as if none of it had ever been there. I stood there, in the darkness, feeling utterly alone. And then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the echo of those whispers, growing louder, more insistent. You can't escape. I realized then that they weren't just watching me. They were inside my head. The hooded figures, the rituals, the pain. It was all a part of me now. And no matter where I went, no matter what I did, I would never be free. I stumbled back to my apartment, my mind reeling. I could feel them, their presence growing stronger. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me to continue their work, to spread their darkness. And deep down, a part of me wanted to. I sat down at my desk, picked up a pen, and started to write. Not a confession, not a cry for help, but a warning. If you're reading this, know that the darkness is real. It's out there, waiting. And once you open that door, there's no going back. I went on the dark web, and now my life is a living nightmare. They're coming for me, and I don't know how much longer I can resist. But I'll fight. I'll fight until my last breath, because if I don't, they'll win, and the darkness will consume us all. I was losing grip on reality. The line between my memories and my nightmares blurred more each day. The hooded figures were everywhere, in my dreams, in the corners of my vision, in the whispers that filled my head. I couldn't escape them. My friends and family tried to help, but they couldn't understand what I was going through. I tried to act normal around them, but I could see the concern in their eyes, the way they whispered behind my back. They thought I was losing my mind, and maybe I was. One night, I received a phone call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was distorted, but I recognized it immediately. It was one of them. "It's time," the voice said. "Remember the sacrifice." I dropped the phone, my heart pounding. The words echoed in my mind, growing louder and louder until they drowned out everything else. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back to where it all began. I had to find that room, the blood-stained mattress, and confront the darkness head-on. I gathered what little courage I had left and set out. The city felt different, darker, as if it was conspiring against me. Every shadow seemed to hide a hooded figure. Every whisper carried the same message: remember the sacrifice. It took hours of wandering, but I finally found the place, an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung off its hinges. I stepped inside, the air thick with dust and decay. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating broken furniture and debris. As I ventured deeper, I felt a sense of déjà vu. This was the place. I could feel it. I followed the path that seemed etched into my memory, down a narrow hallway to a door marked with strange symbols, the same symbols carved into my chest. I pushed the door open, and there it was, the room from my nightmares. The mattress was still there, stained with blood and God knows what else. The air was thick with the smell of rot. I could hear the faint dripping of water somewhere in the distance. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I stepped into the room, and the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew I couldn't let fear control me. I had to face whatever was in here. I walked to the center of the room, to the mattress. I could see the stains, dark and ominous. I knelt down, trying to piece together my fragmented memories, and then I felt it. A presence, cold and malevolent, watching me. I turned around, and there they were. The hooded figures, standing in a circle around me. Their eyes were hidden, but I could feel their gaze, piercing and relentless. They began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic, echoing off the walls. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, by the overwhelming sense of dread. The chanting grew louder, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest, where the scar was. It burned, as if the symbol was being carved into me all over again. And then I saw her. The woman from the videos, the one who'd been tortured and killed. She stood in the center of the circle, her eyes hollow, her body broken. She reached out to me, and I felt a wave of sorrow and despair wash over me. "They made you one of us," she whispered. "You are the sacrifice." The realization hit me like a freight train. The missing 2 years, the rituals, the experiments, they weren't just torturing me, they were transforming me. I was a part of their cult, their dark, twisted ritual, and now they wanted me to continue their work. The room started to spin, the chanting growing louder, the pain in my chest unbearable. I felt myself slipping away, my mind fracturing under the weight of it all. I knew I had to fight, to break free from their hold. Summoning every ounce of strength I had, I forced myself to stand. The chanting faltered, the figures watching me with their empty eyes. I reached for the woman, and as our hands touched, I felt a surge of power, of defiance. "No," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "I won't be a part of this. I won't let you win." The figures recoiled, their chanting turning to angry whispers. The woman smiled, a sad, weary smile, and then she was gone. The room plunged into darkness, and I felt the ground give way beneath me. I woke up in my apartment, drenched in sweat, the scar on my chest burning. The hooded figures were gone, but their whispers lingered in my mind. I knew they were still out there, waiting, watching. And I knew I had to find a way to stop them. I wasn't just fighting for my sanity anymore. I was fighting for my soul, and I wasn't going to let the darkness consume me. Not without a fight. The days that followed were a blur. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. The whispers in my mind were relentless, urging me to give in, to embrace the darkness. But I couldn't let them win. I spent hours researching cults, dark rituals, anything that could give me a clue about who they were and how to stop them. I found myself in the company of conspiracy theorists and occult enthusiasts, people who spoke in hushed tones about secret societies and ancient evils. Most of it seemed like nonsense, but a few details matched my experiences. Symbols, rituals, the concept of human sacrifices to summon dark powers. I knew I was on the right track, but I needed more. Then, I remembered the tapes. The ones I'd found in the basement. There was one I hadn't watched yet, labeled with a date just before I woke up in my bed. I didn't want to see what was on it, but I knew I had to. I needed to understand the full extent of what they'd done to me. I played the tape, my heart pounding. The video showed me, sitting in a dark room, surrounded by the hooded figures. I looked different, gaunt, hollow-eyed, like a shadow of myself. One of the figures stepped forward, removing their hood. It was Dr. Reynolds. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. He'd been with them all along. He spoke in that strange language, his voice a low chant, and the others joined in. I saw myself rise, my movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. They were controlling me, using me for their rituals. The video ended with a close-up of my face. My eyes were empty, lifeless. I was their puppet, their tool. But now I was free, and I knew what I had to do. I confronted Dr. Reynolds at his office. He tried to play it off, to act like he didn't know what I was talking about. But I saw the fear in his eyes. I pushed him, demanding answers, and finally, he cracked. He told me everything. The cult, their rituals, their quest for power. They believed that by breaking a person's mind and rebuilding it, they could create a vessel for dark forces. I was one of their experiments, a sacrifice meant to bring their dark god into the world. But something had gone wrong. The ritual had failed, and they'd lost control of me. They'd let me go, hoping I'd break down and come back to them willingly. But I hadn't. I'd fought back, and that made me dangerous. I recorded everything he said, every damning detail. I was ready to take it to the police, to expose the cult and bring them down. But as I left his office, I felt a familiar sensation. The sharp pain in my chest, the burning of the symbol. I stumbled, clutching my chest, and felt myself being pulled into the darkness. The hooded figures were there, surrounding me, their whispers louder than ever. I fought to stay conscious, to hold on to my sanity. When I woke up, I was in that room again. The blood-stained mattress, the flickering lights. The figures stood around me, chanting. Dr. Reynolds was there, his eyes cold and empty. He stepped forward, a knife in his hand, and I knew what was coming. But I wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. I felt a surge of defiance, of power. I reached out, grabbing the knife, and plunged it into his chest. The chanting stopped, replaced by screams and chaos. The other figures tried to grab me, but I fought back, slashing, kicking, tearing at them with everything I had. The room seemed to implode, the walls closing in, the lights flickering wildly. I felt the darkness trying to consume me, to pull me under. But I held on, focused on the light, on the memory of who I was before all this. And then, I was free. The room was gone, the figures vanished. I was lying in my bed, the morning sun streaming through the window. The scar on my chest was still there, but it didn't burn anymore. It felt like a mark of survival, a reminder of what I'd been through. I took the recordings to the police, and they launched an investigation. Dr. Reynolds and several others were arrested, and the tapes provided enough evidence to bring down the cult. But the scars, both physical and mental, would never fully heal. I still see them sometimes, in the corners of my vision, in the shadows of my dreams. The hooded figures, watching, waiting. I know they're still out there, still plotting. But I'm not afraid anymore. I've faced the darkness and survived, and I'll keep fighting for as long as it takes. If you're reading this, take my warning seriously. The dark web is not just a collection of shady sites and illegal activities. It's a gateway to horrors you can't imagine, a doorway to darkness. Stay away from it and cherish your sanity, because once you open that door, there's no going back.